Hello, everyone. We'll get started here in just a moment. Give folks some time to join. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are in the world right now. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, U.S. LNG Imports, Analyzing the Permit Approval Process and Environmental Impacts. My name is Sarah Viken. I'm the Manager of Education here at ELI. We have an amazing program lined up for you today, with the DOE pausing new approvals of LNG export projects to investigate the fossil fuels' climate and economic impacts. This program will explore the history of U.S. government action in international LNG markets and energy security, and LNG's environmental and community impacts. I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers for being here today and for taking the time to prepare the insightful content you're about to see for this program. I also want to thank all of our members for tuning in. We appreciate your interest in the topic, and we're excited to see your engagement with it. Today's program will feature commentaries from our wonderful panelists, as well as a roundtable discussion. We will be taking questions further along in the program, so please submit any questions that you have throughout the program using Zoom's Q&A function. Our moderator and speakers will be able to see it, so we encourage you to use the chat for observations and comments, but we'll be pulling discussion questions from that Q&A box. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the event webpage for ELI members to view later. If you're an ELI member and unable to stay for the entire webinar, the recording should be available within a few business days. You can find the recording as well as more information on our other events at eli.org. Before we get started, I want to introduce our wonderful moderator. Starting us off will be Anna Mikulska, your moderator. Anna is a member of the research staff at the Science and Technology Policy Institute under the Institute for Defense Analyses. She has a background in political science, international relations, and law. Prior to joining STPI, she was a fellow in energy at Rice University's Baker Institute, where she co-led the program on energy and geopolitics in Eurasia, and a senior fellow at the Kleinman Center for Good Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. She focused on markets and geopolitics of energy, including the use of natural gas as a geoeconomic tool, and the role of U.S. exports of LNG in the context of domestic and international energy security. Anna's interests also include electoral politics and its impact on energy policy and international systems. She holds a doctorate in political science from the University of Houston, a master's degree in international relations from the University of Windsor in Canada, and a law degree from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland. Anna speaks Polish, English, German, Farsi, and Russian, which I think is so cool. Thank you, Anna, for leading today's program. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You did an amazing job on all the pronunciation of Polish names. So, thank you so much for having me. Really, really appreciate being here, especially given this extremely important topic. So, I will give an introduction a little bit to the topic and then introduce our wonderful speakers. Beyond reasonable distances, pipeline transport of natural gas has become often uneconomic, and then chilling methane to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit enabled economic maritime shipment in especially designed tankers. More recently, it become more profitable, and actually U.S. has built its export capacity since 2016, driven by available natural gas associated with the emergence of large new natural gas producing locations and crude oil production growth. Some of the existing LNG export facilities originated as import terminals in the early 2000s when there was the belief that U.S. would never again see net increases in domestic oil and gas production and would be one of the largest LNG importers. Fast forward 20 years, the U.S. is world's largest LNG producers with 8 operating LNG terminals, 6 projects permitted and under construction, and 7 projects permitted and not under construction. There are 8 projects that are under regulatory review. For comparison of the maximum volumes of LNGs those terminals could supply, the currently operating ones can supply maximum 104 tons MTPAs. The permitted terminals would be able to add almost twice as much, and the terminals that are under the review could add almost the same amount in the future. Of course, not all of the even permitted terminals will actually end up being built, but that's something that potentially we can talk going forward with respect to the pause that the White House announced on non-FTA authorizations to conduct 2 studies, one focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and the other one on domestic economic impacts. As such, permit approval process have become extremely topical and highly debated issues with different views presented in political realm as well as media. ELI has assembled a great panel of experts that can help us in analyzing the stakes of LNG terminals and their permitting to the US environment, economy, and US allies. As such, we'll open with remarks by Elizabeth Craddock, who is a government relations attorney in Holland and Knight's Washington, D.C. office. Ms. Craddock draws on 2 decades of legislative and private sector experience to help corporations, industry, organizations, trade groups, and nonprofit entities work with elected and appointed officials to develop, negotiate, and pass legislation critical to the success of the US economy. Her areas of focus include energy, environment, natural resources, agriculture, climate change, and trade policy, as well as social justice, ethics, sanctions, and governance issues. Liz will give us an overview of the permitting approval process and the environmental impacts. Next, we will have Dr. Tade Oyewumi, who is a law professor and international energy law and policy consultant. Over the past 5 years, he has taught courses and led research projects on energy and natural resources, law, environmental law, and international business transactions at the University of North Dakota School of Law, the University of Oregon School of Law, and the Vermont Law School. His publications include Handbook on Decarbonization and the Energy and Regulation Gas Supply to Power Markets. He will follow up with implication of US LNG exports for energy security and international LNG market. And last but not least, we will hear remarks by Menine Naismith, who is a senior attorney for national climate issues based in New York and focuses on federal permitting and regulation of fossil fuel transportation and export infrastructure. She represents community and environmental groups in proceedings involving gas pipelines, storage facilities, and LNG export terminals before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Department of Energy, and in courts. She has experience leading litigation and rulemaking efforts under the section of 401 of the Clean Water Act and representing environmental tribal clients in state and federal proceedings and other advocacy opposing fossil fuel infrastructure projects under the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Natural Gas Act. Menine also spent many years working on climate-related litigation and advocacy in New York State and the Northeast region. Thank you very much, all of our panelists, for being here. Once we are finished with the presentation, we will follow with a discussion. And as Sarah mentioned, we invite your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you very much. Liz, right? Yes, Liz, please start us out. Thank you.
Yep, I think I'm up. Let me make sure I've got control of the. Oh, I was muted. Let's see. Let's make sure I have control of the presentation. Sorry, looks like I'm having a technical difficulty. Let's see. Says I can control it, but it's not letting me control it. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Liz Craddock with Holland and Knight. Hope you're all doing well today. I'm going to take us on a little political and legal journey as far as it relates to LNG exports from sort of the congressional and administrative side here in Washington, D.C. I have my background as the dome of the Capitol, which is such a pretty a pretty view, so I hope you enjoy it. I almost gave you cherry blossoms because it's peak, or yesterday was peak cherry blossom day here in DC, but the background was a little wonky, so hopefully you enjoy the dome of the Capitol. But my background is in Congress. I spent about over a decade working in Congress. I started on the House side, went to law school at Tulane, and then spent nearly a decade with Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. Obviously, energy production is extremely important to the state. So spent a lot of time working on these issues under her purview. Did all things energy, environment, ag related. Has spent a lot of time here in DC working on these issues. So again, I wanted to sort of take us a little bit on memory lane here to sort of look back at congressional action in this space. I started by just doing a quick search of the congressional record. I wanted to see sort of when the topic of LNG exports started to pop up in the record. And really, there are barely any mentions of LNG exports before 2011. There were one or two mentions along the way, sporadically from the 70s until then, but the topic of LNG exports is really new here in DC comparatively to other topics. It's really just been a little over a decade that we've been talking about this in earnest. So I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of that perspective. We had the first Senate Energy and Natural Resources hearing on LNG exports in 2011. It definitely talked about the Natural Gas Act and how it was focused on imports and really not on exports. That is because until then, we were really solely focused in this country on importing LNG and not exporting it. It wasn't until the advent of hydraulic fracking, which allowed producers to go into deeper areas to discover natural gas, that it really sort of took off in this country. We were definitely expecting to have a natural gas sort of glut here in the US. And then the advent of these new technologies allowed us to unlock, a tremendous amount of natural gas, not only for the US, obviously, but for the rest of the world. I wanted to highlight that point in particular. So in 2001, in a speech by Christopher Smith, who was then the Deputy Assistant Secretary at DOE, he talked about EIA projections in that speech. And, here were the EIA projections in 2001, right? US gas production will increase to 7.2 TCF by 2015. And 12.2 TCF by 2035. So that was in 2011. So now EIA has us at 36.35 TCF in 2022, 37.86 TCF in 2023, and 38.37 TCF in 2024. So we have literally tripled our natural gas production expectations in just under a decade. So it's truly incredible what we've been able to unlock in this country as far as energy is concerned. And this graph just sort of shows that here. It starts in 2010 and just shows, just the growth that we've had in natural gas production in this country. I like this one because it's a little comparative to Qatar and China and Iran and Russia, which are obviously seen as our top competitors in this space. So I think it just depicts, what's happening here in the U.S. visually. I thought it was a good indicator. As was stated earlier, the U.S. is the largest exporter of LNG now. LNG demand is on the rise and is expected to reach 700 metric tons by 2040. EIA had, in 2021 and 2023, the U.S. LNG exports to Europe increased from 29% to 62%. So that's just tremendous growth over a very, very short period of time. So that just kind of sets the stage on, how Congress had, just in 2011, and, 2014, started thinking about LNG exports. In fact, when Senator Landrieu took over the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I was her staff director then. And the first hearing that we did was on LNG exports because it was really becoming such a hot topic that congressional insight and overview was needed at that time. So it's really just been, you know, a short decade that we've really gotten to where we are now. So it all starts with the law, of course, on how DOE and FERC are allowed to permit these projects. So it starts with the Natural Gas Act. So the Natural Gas Act of 1938 requires federal approval of natural gas exports. DOE is responsible for reviewing LNG export applications. And for those of you who may not be familiar sort of with this process, now it's a two-step process. So when you think of DOE's authority, you're really thinking about the authority to export the product to another country. When you're thinking about FERC's authority, you're thinking about the authority to site and permit the actual facility. So that's my thought on how you can sort of break it down if there's a confusion on who has authority over which process. But more specifically, DOE's statutory authority is vested in Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act. It is vested with the Secretary of Energy, and that has been delegated to the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management over at DOE. Section 3A of the Natural Gas Act sets forth a standard for review of most LNG export applications. And here's the exact language. No person shall export any LNG gas from the United States to a foreign country or import any natural gas from a foreign country without first having secured an order of the Secretary of DOE authorizing it to do so. The Secretary shall issue such order upon application unless after opportunity for a hearing finds that the proposed exportation or importation will not be consistent with the public interest. I want to flag public interest for you because that is essentially the linchpin on the pause, and we'll come back to that in a second. But focusing on FERC's authority, it was delegated to it in 1984. DOE delegated it the authority to approve or deny LNG facilities. FERC also authorizes the construction and operation of associated pipelines under Section 7 of the Natural Gas Act. So FERC is responsible for authorizing the construction and operation of facilities located onshore or within state waters that liquefy natural gas and load the LNG onto ships for export. So I wanted to flag this. If it's an offshore facility, that would be governed by BARAD. There are very few, maybe one or two applications over the years that have been offshore, but did just want to flag that. But the focus is really on FERC's permitting process. So FERC conducts an environmental review, a NEPA analysis of the facility to help with its decision. And FERC reviews of applications to construct these facilities can take 2 to 3 years or even more, depending on the facility. Oops, went too far ahead. So there have been a few changes to the permitting process over the years. The Natural Gas Act was amended in the Energy Policy Act of 1992. Congress enacted Section 3C to the Natural Gas Act. It created a different standard of review for applications to export natural gas to those countries with which the United States has a free trade agreement. And we do have about 18 FTAs, countries that we have that agreement with. I think Tadej is going to go more into that in his presentation, but just wanted to flag that there is a separate review process for non-FTA versus FTA facilities. So the facilities that have free trade agreements, that the U.S. has a free trade agreement with, DOE has really very limited or minimal discretion, and those projects and facilities are essentially deemed approved once they go through that process. And then the other major change, I think, over the years, the permitting process was before 2014, there was sort of a two-step approval at DOE. The facilities, the projects would go to DOE and get a conditional approval first. Then it would go over to FERC for the siting and permitting approval process. And then it would come back to DOE for final export approval. So in 2014, that was changed. The sort of conditional approval that was provided at that first step of DOE went away. And DOE only started to look at projects after a completed and satisfactory environmental review of the associated export facility. So that change happened in August of 2014 when DOE finalized this proposal after a public comment and review period. So that was the other major change that happened over the years. Okay, so now we're back to this public interest standard. And this is where you'll, the pause was given to allow DOE to go back and sort of look to make sure that LNG exports are indeed in the public interest of the U.S. So Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act does not define public interest, but there are about 10 criteria that are listed here that DOE will consider in reviewing whether or not a project is in the public interest, and then whether or not it will grant the non-free trade agreement export permit. So as you can see, we've got, domestic need for natural gas proposed for export. We don't want to be competing with our own U.S. demands and needs. Obviously, natural gas still supplies a majority of our electric generation here in the U.S. We don't want to put the U.S. in a situation where if we have low supply, high demand, that we end up increasing the domestic price of natural gas. It's very important to make sure that we have something that's affordable for U.S. citizens. So that's incredibly important, obviously, to DOE and their calculation. Obviously, U.S. energy security is also important. If you remember from the chart earlier, the other major countries who produce vast quantities of natural gas are China, Iran, Russia, Qatar. So we don't have a lot of strong U.S. allies that we can go to if we don't have strong U.S. Natural gas production here in the U.S. Obviously, balance of U.S. trade is important. LNG exports is actually a serious trade surplus for the U.S. We're still running a trade deficit overall versus, once you consider all U.S. exports and imports. So that actually is one area that we can go on the positive or plus side with. International considerations are important. Obviously, we've got the war in Ukraine and other things happening in the Middle East that are extremely important to watch, and those considerations have to be taken into consideration. Another important one is environmental considerations. I know Monine is going to go into that a little later. So you can see there's just, it's a really extreme balancing act on what DOE has to do when trying to determine whether or not it is in the public interest. Okay, so of course there are many legal challenges to these facilities. I think since the first ones were proposed, virtually there have been many lawsuits. These are just sort of three that I cherry picked from the list. But you can have lawsuits on the actual approval of the permit, whether it's challenging FERC's consideration and their approval process, or DOE's. I expect that we're going to continue to see a lot of lawsuits in this space. We have a sort of picture of a letter that was just sent on February 6th. It's 23 state AGs who have signaled, they're going to pose a legal challenge against Biden's pause on LNG exports. So, I think that there will continue to be a lot of legal a lot of legal cases in this space. And so those will obviously be something to watch. Next is what we've done today. What has FERC and DOE accomplished today? So here, if you go on to, I think it's FERC's website, you'll find all the terminals that are existing, approved, and under construction, etc. So this is what they have listed. I know that the first one here is now in Alaska, it's now defunct. So maybe we take that one off the list, but otherwise here are the 8 facilities that have it approved. The total capacity there is 14.43 BCF a day. Here we have the LNG export terminals that are FERC approved and under construction. So these are not shipping LNG to date. That's another 17.53 BCF a day. And the next is FERC approved, but not under construction. And this is 13.34 BCF a day. So the total FERC approved capacity is 45.2 BCF a day. Just as a reminder, the first trains of LNG went from the US in 2016. And so we have 25 total approved FERC projects. So, you know, I focus mainly on Congress and what's happening here in DC. So obviously after the pause, there was a lot of activity. If we went and searched the congressional record now, I think we would find hundreds of references to LNG exports. There have been many speeches on the House floor and on the Senate floor about this. There have been many letters sent, etc. So there has been a lot of activity here in DC talking about the pause and what's happening. On the House side, this bill, HR 7176, that was offered by Representative Pfluger from Texas, did pass. It passed with 9 Democrats supporting the legislation. This would essentially just take away the approval authority from DOE and just leave it with FERC on the approval of LNG exports. So we have seen the House pass legislation and send it over to the Senate side. In addition, Energy and Commerce Committee Chair Kathy Rogers from Washington, she led a letter with more than 150 Republicans to President Biden on February 4th, demanding his administration expeditiously approve all pending applications to increase the global supply of natural gas. So there's a lot happening. Obviously, you can imagine that in a Republican-controlled Congress. There's a lot happening in that space, and I would expect to see more messaging on this in the future, and especially as we ramp up to the elections. On the Senate side, there is a Senate bill. It's 3704, and it would essentially do most of what the House bill would do, but a little more. What I think is sort of interesting here that senators can do that the representatives don't have the ability to do is they can block presidential nominees from moving forward. It takes a lot of time to vote on specific measures in the Senate. You know, Majority Leader Schumer doesn't have a lot of time to process a lot of Biden's nominees. So if they cannot go by unanimous consent, meaning that 100 senators approve of the nomination, then essentially one senator can block them. And so you see here that Senator Kennedy has vowed to block President Biden's nominees to the State Department and to the Department of Energy until the pause is lifted. Obviously, LNG exports is crucially important to his state, and so it's really no surprise that he might do something like that. In addition, the Senate has 4 members of the Republican dais on Senate ENR have also sent a letter over to John Podesta on this issue. So again, there's just a lot happening. Do I think that the House bill will pass in the Senate? Probably not. I'm not sure that they could get to 60 votes in the Senate to make that happen, but I think that they could get pretty close. So I think we might continue to see some congressional action on this in the future. Last but not least, I think, is the elections and sort of crystal balling it. Obviously, what's happening in the US House of Representatives this year has been noteworthy for many reasons. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into all of those now, but I can't, Bloomberg and the folks who put together these charts can't even keep them updated because there are folks leaving the House left and right. We've had 4 members since December that have left. So this number now is Republicans. As soon as Representative Ken Buck leaves, there will only be 218 to 213. So it's one of the smallest majorities for the Republicans, maybe in U.S. history. I do think that the House will likely flip come November. I think that is the expectation, given sort of where the House sits at the moment. It's a different story on the Senate side. We've got 34 seats up in the Senate, and 23 of those are Democratic seats. So it just doesn't, the math just doesn't really work out for Democrats on the Senate side. Obviously, Senator Manchin from West Virginia is one of those Democrats who's up. He's not running again. That seat will flip to the Republicans. Senator Sinema from Arizona is also not running again. And it's unclear what will happen in that race, but it's certainly going to be a toss-up. Other 2 vulnerable Democrats, Senator Tester from Montana, Senator Brown from Ohio. So it's, the map just doesn't look great for Democrats. And I think we can expect that the Senate will shift to Republican control. What does that mean for LNG exports moving forward? We can expect to see, the Senate try to push forward on these measures, but really without Democrats on either side, either in the House or the Senate, pushing for this, I'm not sure there will be enough votes come next Congress to make something like that happen. We'll just have to see what the lineup of Democrats that get elected to these seats, what that entails, and how that shakes out. On the administration side, I mean, we've all seen the polling. It's a toss-up at the moment. Obviously, if President Trump is reelected, the pause would be immediately lifted, and we would be moving forward, I think, in a fast and furious away on LNG exports. And President Biden is reelected, hot off the presses here. Secretary Granholm was at Sarah Week, and on Monday she said, by the time we meet here in this place next year, it's going to be long in the rearview mirror. So I would think that regardless of who is elected, we will likely see the pause on LNG exports lifted within a year. So I know that was sort of fast and furious. Happy to take lots of questions at the end, but that's it for me, and I'll turn it over to Tade.
Tade, would you like to start the presentation? I think we need to also highlight him. Might be that Tade has some connection difficulties. Should we move on maybe and have Menin talk, and then let's move to Tade at the end, so we don't necessarily. Oh, yes. Great. Lenine, would you like to?
Thank you. We'll get Tade back, and technical difficulties always get you no matter how hard you try. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here to present some views about the various ways in which this industry is affecting both environments and communities. I just want to start by saying that any views that I present today are my own. I work with Earth Justice or for Earth Justice, but my views are my own, and I'm also not expressing any views on behalf of any of our clients. And also really want to highlight that many of the impacts of this industry domestically are being felt by grassroots frontline communities. And I am not here to speak on their behalf either. I will certainly try to communicate as best I can what those communities are facing. But at the end of my presentation, I have a list of a sample of websites if folks are interested in learning more about what on-the-ground communities are experiencing and the work that they're doing, that I would really encourage you to take a look at. So stepping back a little bit, Liz, I think, did a good job of outlining the Natural Gas Act authorities that exist. The one piece that I wanted to start with is just remembering that in addition to the Natural Gas Act, these approvals are also occurring underneath the National Environmental Policy Act. And so both FERC and the Department of Energy are responsible for complying with NEPA. And the way that that has worked out, given the shift of responsibilities that Liz outlined, has been that FERC will start with an environmental review under NEPA of the terminal itself. And then that will get passed over to DOE to then take a look at the broader environmental impacts of the export. And that is a kind of an odd chicken and egg division of labor that the DC Circuit has created in a case called Freeport, or not, I think Sierra Club v. FERC, but referred to most often as the Freeport decision, where it determined that even though the impact of shipping the gas, burning the gas is an indirect effect of building a terminal, you can't have one without the other, that the DC Circuit decided to sort of bifurcate the review responsibilities in terms of just the terminal being what FERC has to look at, and none of the indirect effects of the terminal, and then the upstream and downstream effects being things that DOE needs to look at. So starting with the more direct effects, and just to situate ourselves, when we talk about what is an LNG export terminal, we are talking about a massive industrial facility. This is not a small thing. These are huge complexes that process enormous amounts of gas, that take up and burn enormous amounts of energy, and that have very real world impacts on the communities in which they are located. It takes a huge amount of effort and energy to convert what is basically methane into a liquid form. And so there are massive, you can see from the pictures on the screen right now, that you're talking about huge tanks, tankers, and other kinds of facilities to actually get the gas super cooled and compressed down to the point where you can put it in a ship and send it across the globe. Liz already covered this a little bit, but these facilities are primarily located in the Gulf Coast area. There are a couple that are located on the East Coast and one that is contemplated for Alaska. But by and large, when we talk about the LNG build out in this country, we're talking about the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. Not surprisingly, when we talk about the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana and where these facilities are being sited, you are talking primarily about siting them in communities that are either low income or communities of color, or both, and therefore more often than not qualify under EPA's definition of what is an environmental justice community. And that really should have a huge effect on how the impacts of siting more terminals in that area is perceived. the very concept of environmental justice is that these communities, more often than not, are already really overburdened by pollution, and that we should in fact be seeking to unburden them and lessen their pollution burdens rather than doing what we seem to be doing by approving all these terminals in the same area, which is heightening those burdens. These communities not only face burdens from this industry, but they also are surrounded by refineries, petrochemical facilities, and because they are often low-income communities, are struggling with a whole host of other economic and social realities, including inadequate access to healthcare, really, really problematic health outcomes generally, just to name a couple. So what are the direct impacts of these export terminals that FERC is supposed to consider as part of its both review under NEPA, but also in terms of its ultimate determination under the Natural Gas Act of whether these projects, each of them, is in the public interest? There are air quality impacts. These facilities emit huge amounts of ozone precursors, particulate matter. There are real safety concerns. We saw not that long ago a massive fire at the Freeport LNG terminal. There's right now the Pipeline and Hazardous Safety Materials and Materials Administration is and Hazardous Materials Administration is, or PHMSA, it's a mouthful, is undergoing an update to the safety rules that apply at a lot of these facilities. But we have heard a lot of concerns by first responders, by the communities generally, about inadequate information being provided to communities about what's being stored at these facilities, how that might affect the local communities in the context of an emergency. What kind, is there, just basic things like adequacy of evacuation routes, some very, very substantial concerns that by and large are not adequately addressed in PHMSA's rules and not adequately incorporated in FERC's review. Also, just even looking at the facility themselves, you often are dealing with, because they often burn gas to generate their own power to end up powering the liquefaction process, the terminals themselves can be responsible for millions of tons per year, just alone over the span of, the lifespan of these facilities tends to be at least a couple of decades. So huge, what we call carbon bombs. Also, when you site these facilities on the shores of Texas and Louisiana, you are compounding the problem of having the wetlands that have historically protected those areas from hurricanes and storms getting further fragmented, degraded, and really just eliminated. And that also has an impact on species. And some of these facilities, particularly the ones that are being cited in the southern portion of Texas, right by the border, are in kind of a last little pocket of unspoiled area in the Gulf where a lot of animals have gone and started to have gone and been living for a while, and to drop massive industrial facilities like this into their midst is a real problem. And this is just a small sampling. This is not meant to be comprehensive. That would take far too long. So I already kind of touched on this a little bit, but we've seen a whole, and Liz also emphasized that we've seen a lot of litigation around the approval of these terminals, and that litigation is happening both under NEPA and under the Natural Gas Act. Again, just a kind of general overview, not meant to be comprehensive, but there's a really huge problem in failing to account for environmental justice impacts. The Vecinos case, which involves the Rio Grande and Brownsville facilities, is sort of the poster child right now. It was originally went up to the DC Circuit. The DC Circuit found that FERC had done an inadequate job in assessing environmental justice impacts, including the basic step of just even identifying the true number of environmental justice communities that were going to be affected by this facility. And as a result, sent it back down to FERC. FERC then, in its wisdom, basically went and did a process where they identified over 300 more or additional communities, but only ever let the public comment on materials that the companies submitted to FERC. It never provided an opportunity for input and public comment on FERC's own analysis of what does that mean. And they just issued another order approving the project over a pretty vigorous dissent by one of the commissioners. That is back up on appeal in front of the DC Circuit, and we will definitely be watching closely to see what comes out of that. Another big issue is a general underestimation of air quality impacts. These areas are technically many of them in attainment under the Clean Air Act, but that's not going to last for long. And one of the things that there's a tool that has been used by a lot of these facilities to go just under a threshold and not get any additional scrutiny and not ask, among other important questions, what cumulative impact these facilities by themselves, but also adding that into the aggregate of what else is going on in the airshed. So the sort of problem of death by 1,000 cuts, the individual cut might not be that big, but that might be that one cut enough to tip you over the edge. And that's not something that FERC or the state air quality authorities are looking at in enough detail. There was just an argument actually a few weeks ago in front of the DC Circuit on that very question, on challenging FERC's failure to look at the cumulative impacts of air emissions it's a case called Healthy Gulfy FERC, and it's the Commonwealth LNG project at issue. And then across all of these projects, FERC has basically been refusing to determine the significance of climate change emissions. They claim, and this is not unique to their Section 3 cases, they've been doing this in the Section 7 context as well. They claim that they are unable to assess the significance of the climate change impacts of these facilities, even where you have facilities that are, as I mentioned earlier, directly responsible for millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year. FERC basically will do the math and say, okay, well, that's the emissions total, and then do nothing with that number, either to explain under NEPA, well, is that a problem? Is that a bad thing? How does that fit into the context of larger efforts to not just stop increasing emissions, but to actually aggressively reduce emissions? And as well, not then considering the scope and extent of those emissions and how bad those emissions might be in its determination of whether these facilities are in the public interest. The Evangeline Pass case, it's one of many Sierra Club v. FERC cases, so I use the terminal name instead there, is another case that was argued mid-September, and we are waiting for a decision from the DC Circuit any day now. Then you have the problem of DOE and the fact that DOE is supposed to be looking at the upstream and the downstream impacts of having this industry and this very big shift in reality that Liz described in terms of going from a net importer to a very, very huge exporter of gas. And this really comes into play both with respect to the shale plays themselves, LNG exports being a huge driver of additional development of gas and the damage that causes in the various areas of the country where there are gas shale plays available. Another issue that you have to look at is, okay, well, what does that mean from a climate perspective? There are life cycle greenhouse gas emissions at every stage of the process, from production to transmission. FERC looks at the direct impacts of the terminal, but then there are shipping effects, both greenhouse gas and other, and then the effect of having our allies be locked into burning gas for 2 to 3 decades to come. I mentioned the shipping impacts already, and Liz mentioned that, the economic impacts, and this is one of the things that DOE is going to be looking at as part of its pause, but really taking a look at what does exporting increasing volumes of gas mean for domestic consumers. And to date, one of the big problems that DOE's study has had is that it did not look at the distributional effects. And it kind of didn't quite go this far, but almost stopped at concluding, well, a lot of people own stock in gas companies, so that's going to mean that will be a net benefit to the economy, not recognizing that the consumers who are most likely to have the biggest hit from any increased energy pricing are also the consumers that are the least likely to be holders of stock in gas companies. And what does this boom in export and just the ratcheting up of export volumes mean for those sorts of consumers? I've already mentioned this a little bit in terms of the problems with the review, and this is partially, I'll talk a little bit about what we're hoping to see DOE's pause and study process fix. But I would note that right now on the books, thanks to what was done under the Trump administration, is what we call a categorical exclusion. That basically, under the Trump administration's view, would have had DOE conduct no NEPA reviews of any LNG export authorizations at all. So it would have had FERC do its review of the terminals, and then that's it. And a categorical exclusion is a tool under NEPA that is normally supposed to say categorically that there's a certain type of activity that does not warrant review under NEPA, because the idea being that those that particular category of activity is sufficiently benign or in fact environmentally beneficial that we don't need to go through the process of doing a NEPA review. This is a categorical exclusion that the Biden team has said they are not using and they have not used. And we have been told multiple times that it's supposed to come off the books. It's very much at odds with the two studies that Liz mentioned earlier that do attempt to, albeit in a deeply flawed manner, evaluate the effects of both specifically the greenhouse gas emissions of increasing volumes of exports. But we have yet to see an actual rulemaking proceeding to take that categorical exclusion off the books. So we are waiting for that to materialize. But so far, the one approval that has come out under the Biden administration, Alaska LNG, or at least that's one of them, they did do a full NEPA review, even though we are actively litigating that case for the deficiencies in that NEPA review. A number of other problems that I've touched on a little bit, but I'll dive into just a tiny bit more detail is, a big issue with DOE's existing studies of greenhouse gas emissions is that there are a lot of baked in assumptions that exist in those studies that really are not particularly well supported and lead to a lot of conclusions about the fact that LNG exports are a net benefit to climate or are at least are benign. And those include assumptions about the fact that if you don't ship LNG to other parts of the world, they will necessarily build coal or oil-fired energy generation, which is definitely not an assumption that holds true in a lot of instances, definitely not something that's particularly well substantiated in any docket that I have seen, and certainly not true in a part of the world like Europe, where they have aggressive renewable targets. And what DOE's analysis fundamentally ignores in particular is that, it is possible that it might offset coal and oil, but it's also possible that it might get in the way of increasingly of ramping up renewables. And that part of the equation is not something DOE has looked at, although we are hopeful that that will happen under this updating and pause process. Also, a lot of assumptions about upstream impacts, that there will sort of, among other things, one of my pet peeves recently was in its decision on the Alaska LNG project, which would facilitate the development of gas on the northern slope on the North Slope in Alaska. DOE made assumptions like, well, yeah, this is going to have significant effects on indigenous hunters, but they'll just go elsewhere, so that's okay. So there really isn't, there's a lot of work to be done on taking true account of what those upstream impacts mean. Additional fracking has a whole host of really environmentally damaging consequences, health consequences that DOD has not fully accounted for. I think I already talked about sorry, I went backwards. I did not mean to do that. About the economic impacts and the need to really account for distributional impacts. But I would also, and this dovetails into the next point, just say too, that there needs to be a real incorporation of environmental and energy justice considerations, including economic impacts to environmental justice communities, that has yet to happen in DOE's review. I'll stop there, leave time for questions. As I mentioned, there are really wonderful frontline groups and communities and individuals who live in the Gulf, who are living in the midst of the build out of this industry, whose voices are really, really important. As I said, I don't want to speak for them. And so to the extent that you are interested in hearing more, these are a sampling of the types of organizations that are really working hard to protect their communities from the adverse effects of this industry. And I don't know if we've managed to resolve our technical difficulties to get Tade back online, but that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Manine. Do we have Tade available? Yes. Hi, Tade.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
It's a little bit on the quiet side, but we can hear you.
Okay, let me so is it better now?
It's okay, we can hear you.
Better? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. All right. Thank you, Anna and Sarah, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to the ELI for inviting me to share some thoughts about this important topic. So the previous speakers, Moni, Elizabeth, and Anna already discussed a lot of touched on a lot of the important issues that arise when considering the energy dynamics of developing complex projects like LNG export projects, and also the implications for the international gas market and energy security generally. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but I'll try to just focus on some of the key questions or issues that have even came up when Moni and Elizabeth was talking, right? So a key question that comes up within the context of the discussion today is, so there is a projection, first of all, there's a projection by the EIA that between now and 2027, 2030, there's a likelihood that the export capacity of LNG projects in North America, as Mexico, Canada, and the US, will increase will essentially double. That's the capacity. So first of all, there's a difference between capacity and actually supplying and being able to produce or even construct the project, right? So capacity arises after the project has been approved, and then there's the construction the project has been completed, and then there's a possibility of actually exporting based on contracts that have been signed. And before projects are approved, one of the key parts of approving the project is, for example, DOE considers the contract signed between the project developers and the potential buyers. And so all that ties into the question of looking ahead, will and should the LNG export capacity of the United States, right? Will it increase within the next between now and 2030, for example, or 2027, based on those projections, following the DOE's review, the ongoing review, and after the pause. So to answer that question, it's important to consider what are the energy policy dynamics at play here, right? Because the rationale behind approving or considering the project is to ensure that there is adequate supply of affordable and reliable energy to end users. But in this context, of course, LNG is usually an export project designed to supply gas to the international market. And you want to be able to supply at an affordable and a competitive manner, and also supply reliable energy that meets the objective of security of supply, but also in a sustainable and environmentally sustainable way, which also speaks to the need to consider things like climate impact and environmental impact, environmental justice consideration that Monin was already talking about earlier on. But to have a comprehensive approach to energy planning and investments, or whether an investment should be made in a particular energy infrastructure, because really there is no energy infrastructure or any large-scale infrastructure that will not have one impact or the other, right? So the question is, what is the impact and what is the trade-off between the impact and the benefits, right? What is the benefit of the project in itself? Now, in an energy context, you want to be sure that the project meets the demands, requirements of affordability. It has some kind of reliability and security of supply, and it's done in a very sustainable and environmentally friendly way, right? So those are the key considerations in all the issues that have been coming up with the Texas project being considered, the litigations coming up and all of that. So what we're simply asking the DOE and FERC and all the institutions to do is to strike a balance. Now, it's a very delicate and complex endeavor, but there are ways that this can be resolved, and that balance can be effective, basically. And which I will not have time to get into all those options, but there are ways that those kind of concerns and issues, can be resolved. For example, during the review process, there are requests that could be made of the appraisal sponsors to deal with a particular issue, like capturing emissions or stopping emissions or installing a particular facility that would address all those concerns. But focusing on energy security, it's just simply the uninterrupted availability of energy supply, energy resources, and at an affordable price. So there are two major sides to that. You have long-term security and short-term security. Long-term security means that the industry and the stakeholders are able to facilitate, timely investments in the needed development of those resources. It could be solar, it could be wind, it could be natural gas. But in this case, we're looking at natural gas, right? What is required to be considered to have an investment decision in order to supply demand in an affordable and a reliable way? So in the long term, while considering the economic and the environmental issues like we've been talking about. So the other aspect is short-term energy security, which is just simply the ability of the energy system as it is, not necessarily as it ought to be, right, but as it is right now, right? For example, in Europe, you have a system where for over 20 or 30 years has relied a lot on Russian gas, right? And also use a lot of coal. Now, coal has reduced while gas has increased because the gas market has been reformed and restructured in a way to facilitate competitiveness and affordability. Gas hubs have developed over time. You have a hub in the Netherlands where prices are set on a gas-to-gas competition basis. So that helps to promote affordability, right? And also you have the introduction of new technologies like solar, wind, and discussion about hydrogen. So the system as it is, how does it have an ability to respond to sudden changes? For example, when Russia decided to reduce supply, what the EU needed to do at that time in 2021, 2022 was to come up with a mechanism to increase storage capacity and also start fast-tracking the approval of regasification facilities to import natural gas, right? So the demand for affordable resources from, for example, sources like the US, Qatar, Algeria increased. Because the alternative, considering the EU's own energy policy objectives of decarbonization and of promoting clean energy system and renewable energy targets and all of that, the alternative would have been to start using coal or some other more controversial systems, right? So because those alternative cleaner sources, they have their own individual constraints in terms of their ability to, at least for now, cost has gone down, but there are some other systemic constraints. And so the system needs to be balanced, basically, or else, it's going to be really, really challenging to achieve a good system that works for everyone. So this is like a chart that talks about that shows how interconnected upstream activities is with downstream, with midstream and downstream, right? So if you're producing, for example, from a field, like in the US, for example, in the Permian Basin and also in some other basins, you have some basins where most of the fields and producers have what you call associated gas production together with oil. So if you have a lot of oil production with a lot of gas mixed together with that, and you don't have a way to evacuate or monetize or sell the gas, what happens is flaring. Now, flaring is worse than the environmental impact of flaring, of course, is worse than having to process the gas, gather the gas, and sell it to a market that will probably, be burning coal, right? Even though the process of liquefaction and regasification also has its own challenges, right? So those are things that will be considered, that needs to be considered and identified in all these issues, because to import, you need regasification units, and currently the Germans and Europeans are building a lot of regasification capacity. So in terms of striking the balance in international context, this chart is from the British Petroleum Statistical Review of World Energy. And you can see in 2021, this reflects the trade movements of gas for gas supply. And pipelines are in the red lines, LNG supply lines are the blue lines. And you can see that all the pipeline supply from Russia, for example, has kind of reduced drastically since 2021. So that's supply, that energy needs to be, at least between now and the next 10, 15 years, needs to be met somehow, right? Or else there's going to be a lot worse, a lot of a kind of, economic and also social impacts that will need to happen, that will happen. But in a typical project, export program, what are the main supply drivers? You have to maintain security of supply and also agree on prices that will work for everyone. There's usually what you call long-term take-or-pay agreements. And then nowadays, you have spot markets and hub trading and all of that. So long-term take-or-pay agreements. Now, most of the projects that will be impacted by the pause and the review that is currently going on, most of them have signed 20-year, 25-year long-term take-or-pay agreements. And now, if you now look at on the flip side, the importers, the European market, where most of the gas is going to, and also the Southeast Asia, there are decarbonization policies in place that, have set, for example, a target to reduce gas drastically after 2040 or after 2030. So, there needs to be a balancing and an identification of how this is going to work. But I think the market has an important role to play, and contracts have an important role to play in helping to strike that balance that the institutions need to make. So because of time, I think I would. So you also have shipping terms, force majeure, change of law provisions, and also winter conditions. In the EU, for example, the warmer winter that took place this winter, led to, for example, more reduction, or it had a good impact in terms of there wasn't a lot of stress or tightness in the market, in the supply market. So the gas storage reserves were still there. They had excess natural gas supply. So that really reduced the price of the supplies coming in. So the US has accounted for 27% of total gas being supplied to Europe, which is like the main market, where some of this energy policy dynamics is going to be playing out, because Europe, first of all, needs to maintain energy security, diversify sources of supply, but they're also trying to ensure that the renewable energy targets and also the decarbonization targets are met. So striking that balance is a very interesting one that is playing out in Europe at the moment. Yeah, but in terms of what are the issues now for the current export project being considered, you have one of the critical considerations is which markets are those projects being designed to supply. So you have markets where you have the US already has a free trade agreement with the country or with the market, or there is no free trade agreement between the US and that country. So if the US has a FTA with the import destination country, then it's automatically deemed to be in the public interest. There are several reasons for that, and that probably usually leads to a better outcome at the end of the day, after considering all the other factors like environmental and all of that. But if there is no FTA with the particular destination country or region, then it needs to go through that thorough hard look review, NEPA review, and all of that. And there is no presupposition or assumption of a public interest factor. So you have about 20 countries with FTAs with the US. Panama is the most recent one. And the main rationale why, this, I'm not sure I'll have time to go into the dynamics of any international trade law and international investment law as pertains to FTAs and all of that. But the main rationale is when you have an FTA between two countries, the countries have decided to, for their own interest, agree on certain trade principles. And one of them is national treatment. That means we will treat one another's companies, investors the same way. There will be no discrimination. There will be no expropriation. There'll be legitimate interests to be protected and all of that. And then also there usually is going to be a free trade zone where companies from and operators from both countries can develop and transact and do trade and facilitate investments, basically. So, and also that package usually has its own way of resolving disputes and systems. So it makes sense to presume that whatever investments is going into that country or within that framework is in the public interest. So the other countries will need to really justify what is the public interest involved. So the public interest, like I think Elizabeth already discussed a lot of that, and Monin already discussed a lot of that, the environmental side, and also the security, national security side, as Elizabeth hinted earlier on. So it's an important, those are important factors and elements to be considered. And time will tell, really, time will tell. So this chart shows, in terms of North American capacity, what are the projected or expected projects that are coming up? And it's expected, like I said, that the capacity, the approved capacity between now and 2027 will double. But the question is, will that, in terms of the US capacity, should those projects being proposed be approved? Then that means the capacity for US will increase. But if they are not approved, then of course, like I said, the international gas supply system is now integrated. There's a market system in most places, and demand, once there's demand, then it's probably going to be met by other sources of supply like Mexico, Canada, or Qatar. So there needs to be a delicate balance when all these issues are being considered. And maybe agreements like community benefit agreements or environmental justice agreements needs to be considered when developing these projects or reviewing these projects, maybe. But time will tell, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for discussion and a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I will start maybe with kind of trying to analyze the presentations, because I think it was really interesting, and it seemed to me like that they have been really underscoring the issues with natural gas and LNG export, and this kind of push and pull of different aspects. On one hand, the environmental effects, on the other hand, the energy security issues, both of which impact people's lives, right? To the point where they could actually be seriously hurt by missing one or the other, and in quite significant manners. The other thing that I hear is this kind of distinction between domestic and international effect in both, in terms of energy security effect, right? Because do we have enough in the US? Do we have too much in the US? But also, and then does the world have enough for energy security purposes, or also for in terms of access to fuel that is more or less CO2 intensive? And that's where the environmental aspects come in. Does it mean that if US cuts on LNG export, does it really mean that it cuts on the CO2 emissions globally? Does it mean that it or if it doesn't cut, does it mean that it cuts into, or it negatively impacts US pledges in terms of environment and climate? And what does it mean? And it seems like none of the US administrations really have figured it out. It's different people point to different issues that it's at the top of their mind, or at the top of their mind of their constituencies. What I did not hear, and I would love to hear from you about this, is what are the real impacts of that pause in LNG permits? Because what pretty much everybody has underscored, we have quite a lot permitted. Not all of this would be built, right? Well, now actually more of that could be built because there will be less of a competition from the non-permitted projects. So in that sense, is there really going to be an impact in terms of US LNG export, or maybe it won't? And what are other potential impacts that this pause would have? I don't know if there's anybody who wants to start. Liz?
Yeah, I'll be happy to take a first crack at it. Just maybe it's just being a DSC for as long as I have been, in election years, things certainly happen. And so I think you could make the case in on both sides, right? I mean, I think that you'll have the Republicans here in DC who will certainly say that, it does matter from investment decisions. It's really hard for these multi-million-dollar facilities to move forward without having regulatory certainty. And this sort of upends that. I think you're definitely seeing that case with a particular project in Louisiana. I hear that maybe its FERC approval is coming tomorrow or sometime this week. And then having a pause on DOE could jeopardize that project, right? So I think that you'll certainly hear that. I think on the opposite side, you've clearly got a president who is wanting to play to his base. Obviously, the progressives really want to see reduced fossil fuels produced in this country. LNG exports is a way that ramps up here in the US. And stopping those from moving forward certainly plays into that playbook and can help sort of, get some support behind the current president as he moves into this election. So I think it just depends on, where you are, frankly. I think you can make a case on both sides, but these DOE export approvals do take some time. From my understanding, there probably wasn't going to be another one approved before the election. And if that's the case, then potentially it doesn't really have an impact. But I do think for giving companies some certainty as far as the regulatory certainty that they need to move forward, it certainly doesn't help that.
So can I actually respond directly to that? Because I actually disagree on the regulatory certainty.
Absolutely, it's a discussion.
And I think that stems from just the litigation that we're talking about. And, I think we have to keep our eye on the ball as to why DOE has said we're going to take a pause. And also recognize that these are projects that would not be in operation for many, many, many years to come. We're talking about a whole other wave beyond what's already been approved. And we may not, there may not even be a market for those projects at that point, let alone are they guaranteed to go forward. But more importantly, I think we have seen so much litigation and it's only going to ramp up. And so to the extent DOE is sitting there with studies, I mean, to your point, Anna, there hasn't been a comprehensive look at really what does this industry mean for our climate commitments, for what it means for and not just commitments. These are not abstract commitments. These are commitments to try to keep this planet from not going above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we've already seen the incredibly adverse effects of climate change in this country and beyond. So what we are hoping DOE is going to do is to actually take a look at both the changed nature of what we know about climate change compared to when it did its last review in 2018, as well as the fact that the volume that has been approved that is so much bigger than it was at that point. And they are reassessing, well, okay, what does that mean? So to move forward while they admit that their own data isn't up to date with processing applications doesn't make any sense and doesn't create regulatory certainty. And all it does is create a situation where what we're seeing at FERC is a great example. FERC has said, well, we don't know how to assess climate significance, so we're just not gonna. And that has just opened the door to a whole laundry, I mean, just litigation after litigation after litigation after litigation. And what ends up happening there, based on what we're seeing in some of these oral arguments, is that if those decisions get overturned, that's not good for the companies either. That creates a whole laundry list of problems for investors, for construction schedules. What happens if it's partially built? It's a mess. I mean, we've seen this in some of the pipeline cases. So to say, for DOE to say, look, temporary timeout, we're going to go get our ducks in a row. We're going to go do a better analysis so that when we turn back to these projects, whatever we decide is more defensible in court, I think actually is a very rational way to proceed, and creates, a lot more regulatory certainty than the alternative.
All right. Can I say something?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think this is a very dicey situation, but the truth is, the way the industry is not a new industry. The gas industry is not a new industry, right? And we know most people know the impact. The DOE is familiar with the industry. The industry is familiar with what DOE needs to consider, right? So it's good to take a pause, but as long as there's a clear, goal as to what exactly the pause is about. The pause is to check whether there is new data or new information that will influence, investment decision, all of that in this project, and looking at the impact the project will have. So there are two kinds of impact: domestic market impact, international market impacts, environmental impacts, and the other impacts we've talked about, economic impacts, right? So it's very complex. These are very complex issues, but it's not something that is strange, right? And the way, for me, the way the contracts have evolved over the years, for example, a lot of long-term supply contracts would not be signed unless there is a credit-worthy buyer, unless there's a demand for the gas. And even if market changes, let's say a contract is signed for 25 years and you get to point year 7, the 7th year, and suddenly there's a lot more hydrogen in the system in that particular destination. There's now what you call destination flexibility. So operators or suppliers can actually go to where the demand is highest. And this is not America alone in the world of energy, right? It's Bangladesh, it's India, it's China, it's geopolitics, right? So it's not just one issue, right? So the models need to consider all of that and see that, okay, how do we not shoot ourselves in the leg? Because, for example, the nuclear power plant was shut down in New York recently. What was the case with the nuclear power plant? It wasn't a very massive amount of solar panels. No, it was 2 gas-fired power plants. I think a couple of years ago. Why? Because there are systemic issues that needs to be identified from an energy policy perspective, right? So, Germany. I was in Europe between 2013 and 2017, and there was this talk about more renewables and targets for 30%, 32% renewables by 2030 and all of that. But the interplay between the emission trading scheme, not setting an appropriate price on carbon, and the interplay between shutting down nuclear power plants, which are actually cleaner than gas and every other system, and led to more pollution, more use of coal, right? So, and then came the Russia effect, right? So, but I think it's good to take a pause, but the pause also should not affect certainty, like Elizabeth was saying. But also the environmental impact needs to be considered and dealt with appropriately. There are ways of dealing with this. It has been done in Norway. It has been done in Australia. The industry is not a new industry, right? Thank you.
I think it speaks to the point of that everybody's talking. For all the panelists are talking about data, well-designed studies, and transparency that could generate more public trust, and then ability to respond to public interest, or even in terms of environmental justice, right? Because that's what's important. Otherwise, we have no idea how, who, and how gets impacted, and then we cannot design potentially energy exports in a way that could be less problematic, or could emit less methane, or so on. If these are actually market-driven, they need it from the global perspective, and so on. And I think that's kind of there's 2 questions that were asked about methane pledge and the US methane pledge and the COP28, which this is kind of the answer to that. We don't know how this will impact the US methane pledge, either the LNG exports or lack of thereof in 20 or like in 10 years, because that's as Menin was saying, these will not be here immediately. It takes about 4 years from the approval to build LNG terminal. So it takes a while. The one question that I want to maybe quickly address, but that's a question is, to my knowledge, almost no FERC or DOE LNG permitting applications have ever been denied. What would be a successful legal challenge around the public interest that could deny an LNG application from either agency? I'm sure, Menin, you probably have some ideas, because that's what kind of was your.
Yeah, and I know we're very short on time, so I can try to make this really quick. I mean, I think part of the.
Oh, we lost Menin.
Either DOE or FERC sufficiently critical eye to bear on these applications, that even if you want to admit that some of these projects should go forward, the fact that all of them are being applied or are being approved across the board with very little mitigation measure, with very little accounting for the effect to environmental justice communities is an incredible problem. But there have been successful legal challenges so far. I mean, it's still working its way out. And some of this is that it's a new enough industry that I think a lot of the legal history is yet to be written. But the Vecinos case is an example of a successful legal challenge insofar as the DC Circuit did send that back down to FERC, did say, this approval is not legally sound, you have to do it again. How that case ends up turning out in terms of, you know, where those terminals end up and do they end up getting constructed, and certainly what will the court do with the second round of that case remains to be seen. But I think that's an example of where how FERC is reviewing these facilities has not been acceptable to the court, and so we will see if that actually does change how the agency itself does these reviews.
Anybody else? Liz? Quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 10 criteria are meant to give the agency wiggle room, frankly, at the end of the day. And so until either Congress acts to make this more permanent or give more definition to what the public interest really is, you know, I don't know if we're going to see really any changes on that. I think it will be resolved in the courts, frankly.
Thank you so much. We are right at 1:30. I will give now this stage to Sarah. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. It was a really excellent discussion, and I hope it contributed to some more information that ELI members now have. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you, Maneen, Liz, and Tade. It was all, I wish we had more time for discussion. It was great. Thanks for all of your presentations, for overcoming a couple technical difficulties. We really appreciate all of you joining us and taking the time to prepare content for us. And again, thanks, wonderful audience, for spending some time with us this afternoon for all your questions. If you couldn't attend the full webinar, joined late, you'll be able to watch the recording on the event webpage in a couple of days. You can also find bios on everybody, as well as all of the presentations on that event webpage. We hope to see you at some future programming. You can find it all at eli.org. And with that, thank you very much and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.